all right? So we've started talking the last few weeks about voices, this voice in our head that leads us, that directs us, that guides us, that speaks everything to us, that just kind of determines the way that we go. That all of us, when as we're listening, matter of fact, as you're listening right now, you have thoughts that are going in, that are saying things to you about what I'm saying. And for some of you, it's favorable. For some of you, yeah, I like this, it's familiar. For others of you, it's negative, or maybe, just for whatever reason. And I've discovered that it affects the way we hear things. It affects what impacts us. It affects what we see, what we do. It affects, the way that we respond. I've said this before. Sometimes I've had conversations with people, and I've had enough experience with them that I know that when we leave, that the conversation we had is not the one that will be replayed in their mind. And sometimes that's the way it is because whatever's impacted us, whatever shaped us, then that becomes the predominant voice that we deal with on a regular basis. And the things that can shape that are things from our past. We're going to talk about our fears in the future, how that voice of fear impacts us. You're going to really, really like that. I think it's really going to speak to you, really help you. It's spoken to me. And today we're going to talk about those family voices, those things that we grew up with that spoke to us in the way that they shaped our mind. One story I've shared with you several times was just for me that, being brought up in a home where, my dad worked in a steel plant. My mom worked for Fram. She worked in payroll there. And so they had what you'd call blue collar jobs. And for whatever reason I had in my mind, I heard a friend of mine went and played golf, but in my mind, the kid of blue collar workers didn't go to golf courses and play golf. And it wasn't like there was a sign that said, steel workers' kids aren't welcome. Or anything like that. It was just this thought that I had that I didn't even realize I had until one day I was telling about a friend of mine playing, how much fun that would be. And my mom got the S&H Green Stamp book off the shelf. And I know that dates me. Some of you are like, what are S&H Green Stamps? Google it. And so here's the thing. Is that she got it off the shelf and went and bought me golf clubs. And so it lifted a lid that was just there, that for whatever reason, through my experiences, I had placed there without even realizing it. And it was one of those things that God has used throughout my life to connect me in relationships, to open up doors for me. Just this little simple thing that was removed by this one small act of my mother did not see me with limitations, but did that for me. Now, I know this, we all have different stories. That I didn't grow up in a perfect home, but I grew up in a pretty secure home. My mom and dad, like everybody else, I think like everybody else, they're certainly like me and Tina. They had arguments, and there were times like that. But before my dad passed, they experienced 50 years of marriage together. That's not everybody's story, right? But as mine, Tina's story is completely different. Her parents split when she was 3, and she was raised. Her mother loved her, but she was raised in a situation with a man he was an alcoholic, and he was a mean alcoholic. And so her story was she even spent some time in foster care. So mine and her story as kids were growing up. And so sometimes, especially in our early years of marriage, those voices would compete with each other. The voice that I had from the upbringing I had, and the voice that she had from the upbringing she had. And not all the things in me were healthy. And there were things that were put into me that my parents believed that weren't necessarily true. It wasn't because they didn't love me, they just were wrong. But there were a lot of things they put into me that were accurate and were right. And so for all of us, we have those things. And so, I know that when you're in here today and your story, in your childhood, your raising may have been really good, really healthy. Again, I know it wasn't perfect, but it's good. But for some of you, maybe you identify with, when I share some of Tina's story, what yours is like. Maybe it was kind of chaotic, kind of insecure, maybe at times feeling kind of broken. And so we want to look at that, how those things shape us. So let's start off in Judges chapter 11. Judges in the Old Testament, if you're still learning your way around the Bible, there's an Old Testament and a New Testament. The Old Testament starts with Genesis. There's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges. And so Judges is the 7th book of the Bible. You're like, why do they call it Judges? Well, before Israel had kings, God would raise up different men and women to lead them. There were people like Gideon and Samson and a lady named Deborah, different people that he raised up at different times to lead the people of Israel, to help them, to lead them through crisis, to lead them through critical situations. And we're going to look at one guy that maybe some of you have never heard of. He's mentioned very briefly, and he has an interesting beginning. And so in Judges chapter 11, verse 1, it says this, now Jephthah of Gilead was a great warrior. Now listen to this. He was a son of Gilead, but his mother was a prostitute. Gilead's wife also had several sons. And if you haven't gathered by now, she was different than Jephthah's mother, two different women. So she had several sons, and when these half-brothers grew up, they chased Jephthah off the land. You will not get any of our father's inheritance, they said, for you are the son of a prostitute. So Jephthah fled from his brothers and lived in the land of Tob. Soon he had a band of worthless rebels following him. That's a pretty good description. At about this time, the Ammonites began their war against Israel. And when the Ammonites attacked, the elders of Gilead sent for Jephthah in the land of Tob. The elders said, come and be our commander. Help us fight the Ammonites. But Jephthah said to them, aren't you the ones who hated me and drove me from my father's house? Why do you come to me when you're in trouble? Because we need you, the elders replied. If you lead us in battle against the Ammonites, we will make you ruler over all the people of Gilead. So if you'll continue reading this event, you'll discover that he did. He came back. He led them. They did make him ruler. He led them to a great battle, to a great victory. But his beginning was incredibly, it was one of those things when you look at his beginning that it's not one of those that you would necessarily be proud of or whatever. And I think the thing that's interesting about it is just like the rest of us, that his beginning he had no control over. He had no control over who his father was. He had no control over who his mother was or the circumstances that they were living their lives in by that time or the way in which he became conceived or whatever. And yet it's amazing that for so many times, so many of us, that if we have a beginning like that we had no responsibility of, yet sometimes we still choose to embrace the label that comes with the beginning that was completely out of our control. And so many times people are like, I wish I'd have been born into a different family. I wish I hadn't been born into these circumstances, into this situation. I wish that my mother would have done this. I wish that my father would have done this. I wish that this would have been the situation. And all of those things that we deal with so often, and it becomes a label that we use to define ourselves and define who we are. Many of you are familiar with Dave Thomas, that he was the guy that started Wendy's. And, his story is very interesting to me. I remember watching him in an interview before he passed away. And he said there were three things that he was ashamed of. And I listened, and one of the things was the circumstances in which he came into the world. The second thing was the fact that he was put up for adoption. And the third thing was that he had not graduated from high school. And I thought, of those three things, only one of them he had any control over whatsoever. And the other two he had no control over whatsoever. And yet for a period of time, he carried it as a badge of shame. He thought it was a badge of disqualification when some people looked at him. And I thought, man, you had no control over whether or not you were put up for adoption. But here's what he did is he began to turn away from that voice that had defined him for so long. He looked at his adoption and he began to say he developed this organization that helped other children become adopted. He went back and got his high school diploma. That there were things that for the longest time that had shamed him and that put a label on him that was undeserving because he had nothing to do with it, that he turned away from letting it be his identity for a period of time, and he began to shape the identities of others by the decisions that he made. And so many times you and I, as we get these things that are in our lives that we raise up in certain situations, and maybe your story's like mine, that again, you weren't raised in a perfect home, but it's pretty secure. Maybe your story's like Tina's, that you spent time in pretty rough situations. When she was 15, she was put in a situation where she tried to call, different family members and wasn't able to do it. And finally her brother came and got her and helped take her to a safe place. Maybe you can identify with that story. And so many times, we embrace these tags, we embrace this identity of how we were brought into the earth and the situation we came into the world, and we try to let it shape who we are. And it becomes a voice in our head of you're not good enough because these are the circumstances you were born into. You'll never be accepted because this is who your family is. You'll never be accepted because this is what your family did. That's not you. That's not you. One of the things that you can say when you become a Christian is that you become a part of God's family. He becomes your father. Talk about a pedigree. 1 John 4:4 says, you're not of them, little children, because greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. You've been born of God. And so that becomes our identity. That becomes who we are. You're a child of the Most High. But so often that voice in our head begins to disqualify us, not because of anything that we've done, but because of the circumstances in which we came into the world. I remember years ago when I was doing student ministry, we had a young lady in our group. And so there were times that she really struggled. And when I got to know her a little bit, I said, tell me why you're struggling so much. And she said, my parents were young and they're dating. They were teenagers and my mom, got pregnant and they just felt like they were supposed to marry each other. And every time they get into a fight and they regret that decision, they blame me. They're like, if you hadn't come along, then we wouldn't be married and we wouldn't be going through this pain right now. And she said, I just feel so responsible for the pain that they experience in their life. And I'm like, you had nothing to do with it. None of that was your responsibility. And yet the voice in her head would continually tell her, this is your fault. Some of you hear that same voice. Some of you, it steers the direction of your life. It causes you to step back when you should lean in. That you put up automatic doors like I did in that one situation and say, you're not welcome. And we have to know this. Number one is this, is that your beginning is not an indication of your worth. That your beginning is not an indication of your worth, of how valuable you are. That however you entered into this world, you were not a surprise to God. You were not a mistake to Him. Ephesians 2:10 still says that you are His masterpiece, created to do good things from the beginning of the world. That you're God's masterpiece. He's created you to do good things. Well, these were the circumstances I came in here. So what? You didn't decide that. Those weren't your choices. God has a plan for you. And that voice that tries to disqualify you, constantly tries to tell you that you don't belong, that's not God's voice. And you have to begin to push that away and not give heed to it, not listen to it, not let it define you. So number one is this, is that your beginning is not an indication of your worth. Look at number two, if you would. Go with me to 1 Samuel 17. You're in Judges. 1 Samuel is like 2 books over. There's Judges, then Ruth, and then 1 Samuel. And as I told you before, over the next few weeks in this series, we're going to talk some about David and Goliath, and each one of the messages we do about this. Like I said, in a few weeks, we'll do one on fear. I think it's really going to speak to you. It's just like Goliath spoke to David. That was fear trying to challenge him and all those kind of things, how we respond to that. Well, there's also that voice from our family that comes. David experienced that. As I shared with you before last week, that David showed up. His father had sent him to this place. He said, look, your brothers are in battle. They're going to face the Philistines. Here's some food. Take it to them. Here's some for their captain and see how the battle's going. So David went. He was in charge of the sheep. And he left somebody with the sheep and he went. And so when he gets here, this is what happens. In verse 22, it says, David left his things with the keeper of supplies and hurried out to the ranks to greet his brothers. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, came out from the Philistine ranks. Then David heard him shout his usual taunt to the army of Israel. As soon as the Israelite army saw him, they began to run away in fright. Have you seen the giant, the men asked? He comes out each day to defy Israel. The king has offered a huge reward to anyone who kills him. He will give that man one of his daughters for a wife, and the man's entire family will be exempted from paying taxes. David asked the soldier standing nearby, what will a man get for killing this Philistine and ending his defiance of Israel? Who is this pagan Philistine anyway that he is allowed to defy the armies of the living God? And these men gave David the same reply. They said, yes, that is the reward for killing him. So David comes up. He sees this battle-hardened Philistine that was one of the enemies of Israel, who had a reputation. He was fearful. He was somebody you were to fear because of his size and because of his reputation. And so they'd heard of him, and he makes this challenge, and they're all afraid of him. Like, have you seen this giant? And so they said, the king will do this. And David happens to overhear him. And like I said last week, keep in mind, David's a teenager. And even though he's godly, he's still a teenager. So when he hears these things, they're like, well, your family don't have to pay taxes, and he gets to marry the king's daughter. And I can imagine being a teenage boy, he's probably like, which one? That one over there, her? I'll kill him. So, I mean, he's like, I'm going to fight him, it's what teenage boys do, right? And so, but he had this confidence in God. So he asked, and he said, hold on, wait a minute. So he asked somebody else, what's going to happen? Well, his older brother is there. And it says, but when David's oldest brother, Eliab, heard David talking to the men, he was angry. Well, why would he be angry? He was angry. What are you doing around here anyway, he demanded. What about those few sheep you're supposed to be taking care of? I know about your pride and your deceit. You just want to see the battle. What have I done now, David replied. I was only asking a question. So right here with David, he's faced with that situation. He's asking and all those other things. Now, I will tell you that David to me, he's one of the most fascinating people in the Old Testament. He was a man of God. He was a man after God's own heart, and yet his brokenness is more evident probably than any of the other people in the Old Testament that we see. I mean, he made some huge mistakes. And I don't know about you, but I can identify with that because I want to be a guy after God's own heart, and yet I do some really stupid things sometimes. And so I can identify with this guy. I'm like, man, if he can be, then there's hope for me. And yet when you look at things that took place in his childhood, it's pretty interesting. There was a guy named Samuel that was a leader in Israel, and God had called him to say, I want you to go to this guy's house named Jesse, and I've called one of his sons to be king. Well, Jesse happened to be David's father. So Samuel goes to Jesse's house, and he says, God's called me here to anoint one of your sons king. So Jesse invites all the sons in except one. Do you know which one that was? David. Why would he not invite him in? So Jesse goes through the boys, Samuel goes through the boys and he says, none of them, this is not it. Don't you have any more kids? And he goes, well, there's one. And he's out taking care of the sheep, which was not an honorable job. Now, I've done some research on David, and this is one of those things that's kind of up in the air, but I thought it was fascinating. I'm like, it's just so weird, the relationship that he seems to have with the rest of his family. And some Jewish historians, some of the ancient Jewish texts, believe that David's father thought that David was not his. And so, but he dearly loved his wife. Later on, they find out that he was wrong. But during this, for years, he thought that wasn't his son, but he loved his wife so much that he encouraged his sons to take their anger, their animosity out, not on their mother, but on David. And so that's why they would leave him alone with the sheep and endanger his life. That's why when Samuel would show up, that there was nobody there that they could anoint, because David was out in the field. That's why when he shows up to this, that his brother looks at him and goes, you don't belong here. Some of you have heard that voice most of your life. You don't belong here. And it's the voice of rejection. And it's so powerful because typically it comes from the place that we're supposed to most belong, which is in our home, which is among our family. And yet David's oldest brother said to him, you left those sheep alone? It wasn't trying to hold him accountable for his character. It was trying to remind him of his place in this family. And for some of you, that's the message you've heard most of your life. You don't hold the same position that everybody else does here. And it's created a wound of rejection that everywhere you go, there's this expectation that somewhere along the line, they won't want me. Somewhere along the line, they're going to remind me that I'm not a part of this. Somewhere along the line, they're going to tell me that I don't belong here. And so it affects everything that you do. Anytime that there's any kind of confrontation, anytime that there's a possibility for conflict, instead of you hearing that, hey, this is healthy, this is how relationships grow, what you hear is, it's just somebody else reminding me that I'm not here, I'm not supposed to be here. So we just shrink back into the shadows and we run from that situation. And it becomes so powerful that it begins to limit what our dreams are, what our visions are, and the places that God wants to take us. I don't think it's any mistake that the Word of God says this, that Jesus was rejected for us. He was despised for us. That He experienced our rejection so that we could be accepted by the Father. And so often we let that wound develop where we hear over and over again, you don't really belong. Where it feels like we're treated over and over again, you don't really belong. And it comes from that place that we're supposed to be the most accepted, our family. And so it becomes a voice that begins to be louder in our ears over and over again, and we become sensitive to the slightest thing that would validate that voice. And it's just too painful to go through it again. So we leave one thing after another, one place after another, one relationship after another, out of fear of experiencing that one more time. I think David's response is something that we should all embrace. It says this, when David's oldest brother Eliab heard David talking to the man, he was angry. What are you doing around here anyway, he demanded. What about those few sheep you're supposed to be taking care of? I know about your pride and deceit. You just want to see the battle. What have I done now, David replied. I was only asking a question. And it says that he turned and asked somebody else. In other words, instead of leaning into the voice of his brother, he turned away from it and went the direction of God's purpose and God's destiny for his life. And we have to begin to turn away from that voice that disqualifies us, from that voice that tells us that we're not enough, from that person, from that relationship that has just created this wound in us that's caused us to question who we are and causes us to question whether or not we belong. To have David's response, and every time that voice shows up, that we turn from it and turn back towards God's purpose and what he has for our life. I'm speaking to some of you right now that you've got to start turning away from that voice. And let me just say this to us as parents. This is why our words are so important over our kids. This is why it's so important that we understand that our words shape their course. They are arrows in our hand, and our words are part of what aims them into the world, the direction that we want to go. My kids are such brats. Is that what you want? That's what you're saying. Your voice will echo in their heart even after you leave this earth. They're significant. Our words matter. So it determines the direction that we go. And for so many of us, that just that voice of rejection will become so sensitive. It creates such insecurities that it almost disables us from enduring hardship, and every relationship has them. It almost keeps us from enduring hardship, and every dream has them. It keeps us from persevering the tough places, and every season has them. Because again, we think what somebody else said about us or what somebody else thought about us or how we were treated when we were younger, that voice of rejection, that it's become our compass, and it's just so painful that we can't endure it again. And so we refuse to go through anything that looks like it. And yet Jesus was despised and rejected for us so that we could have acceptance to our Father. Number 2 is this, is that don't let the lie of rejection make you believe that you don't belong. Don't let you believe that you're not worthy of this, that everybody else can have this but not you. Everybody else can do this but not you. Everybody else can be this but not you. That's the lie of rejection speaking into your world. And if you've made Jesus Lord of your life, then the voice of your Father will constantly remind you that he's made you accepted in the beloved. He's made you accepted into his family. Don't let the lie of rejection make you believe you don't belong. Look at number 3, and we'll close with this. Go with me, if you would, to Genesis 50. Genesis 50. Genesis is the first book in the Old Testament. Genesis 50, verse 16. I love this. Joseph is another one of my guys that I love studying. He was the guy that from a young age, that he'd had a dream. He told his brothers about the dream. And in their insecurity, they hated him for telling them the dream. His parents were even insecure about it. His brothers were going to kill him. But instead they decided to sell him into slavery. He was sold by his family. He was taken into a man's house that he was good to. Later on, that man's wife falsely accused him of raping her. He spent time in prison for a crime that he did not commit. And then even while he was in prison, he helped a guy and encouraged him till he got out, and that guy forgot about him. Joseph had so many reasons to be bitter and angry. Then one day his family shows up. Joseph is promoted. He's the second most powerful guy in Egypt, and his family doesn't know what's happened to him. His father assumes that he's dead. His brothers have no idea, but they just realize they need help from this man in this powerful position, and they show up. They don't recognize him. Joseph recognizes it as his family, and he's so overcome by just emotion that he has to excuse himself. And he goes into the chamber and he weeps. And some of the people even aware, like, dude, what's going on? And so eventually he goes out and he identifies himself and tells his family, it's me, Joseph. So he brings all of his family there. He keeps them into that place. He's good to them. But one day his father dies. Well, his brothers realized how mean they've been to him, and they thought, now that Dad's dead, that was the only thing that kept him from being mean to us. And so now he's going to be mean to us. And so we're going to pick up from there in Genesis 50, verse 16. It says, so they sent the message to Joseph. Before your father died, he instructed us to say to you, please forgive your brothers for the great wrong they did to you, for their sin in treating you so cruelly. So we, the servants of God your Father, beg you to forgive our sin. Now, I don't know why this tickles me a little bit, where it's like they're talking like, what do? We can always tell them that Dad's dying wish was that he be good to us. Hey, I know you weren't there. It was very moving. Me and your brothers were all around, and he said, be sure and tell Joseph not to do anything to you guys. So we just want to deliver that message to you from Dad. I hated that you didn't get to hear it yourself, but here it is. Well, I love his response. He goes this. He said, so we, the servants of God, the God of your father, beg you to forgive our sin. When Joseph received the message, he broke down and wept. Then his brothers came and threw themselves down before Joseph. Look, we are your slaves, they said. But Joseph replied, don't be afraid of me. Am I God that I can punish you? You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people. No, don't be afraid. I will continue to take care of you and your children. So he reassured them by speaking kindly to them. He said this again. Let me read this part again. You intended to harm me. You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people. So many times, man, we think that the things that have happened to us put us at a disadvantage. Well, if I just had different circumstances, the people had just been better to me, then I could have done what they do. I could have been where they are. But Joseph understood this. First of all, he could not let his heart get hardened or bitter towards the people that have wounded him. That in their own brokenness, in their own immaturity, he could not embrace that. One of the reasons is because one of his brothers was a guy named Judah. And Judah was the descendant of Jesus. It was where Jesus came from. And so he could not be bitter or angry and hurt Judah and eliminate Judah, because it would have affected God's plan of redemption for humanity. So he had to have his heart right and be willing to forgive those that have hurt him so that God could promote him. When God promoted him, Joseph had this understanding: you intended to harm me. And there may be people in your life and around you that are part of your story in the past, that there's no way around it, that the things that they did to you were intended to bring pain into your life. There's no way around it, that the decisions that they made and what they said to you and how they treated and what they left you with and what they took from you, that there's no way around it but saying that what they did had every intention of hurting me. And sometimes we can let our story end right there. Or we can be like Joseph and say, you may have intended to hurt me, but God has used this for me, for my good. What do we do with those things? What do we do with that part of our story where we feel abandoned, betrayed, disappointed, wounded? Do we embrace it and we carry it around as an identification of who we are for the rest of our life? Never going any further than that, because to do that would require me to forgive them and to begin to trust again? Or do we realize that no matter what they've done to us, that they do not have the ability to determine the outcome of the plan that God has for my life? I know many of you in here have those people in your life that you could look at them and go, you intended to hurt me. At least you were indifferent. Even if you didn't do it on purpose, you were indifferent to whether it hurt me or not. But that your story doesn't have to end there. Your confidence can be in what they've done to you, or your confidence can be in what God does for you in spite of what they've done to you. You get to choose. Number 3 is this, is that what has been done to you doesn't have the power to keep you from what God has for you. That wherever you go, that voice in your mind that says that you don't belong because you'd heard that, because you'd felt that, that's a lie. Jesus experienced your rejection for you so that you don't have to experience rejection and let it control you. That doesn't have to be a part of what your story is and what your outcome is. You can be like David did and turn away from that voice that's constantly telling you, you don't belong here. Why are you here? Remember your place. And David turned from that voice and he asked somebody else, what will the person get that does these things? Not the person that he's trying to make me, but the person that God has called me to be. What will that person get? And he turned away from that voice. And as you begin to turn away from that voice, you watch as its impact on your life and your relationships begins to minimize as time goes on. And you begin to hear the voice of God's plan, which is so much bigger. And you realize that no matter what anybody's done in their brokenness, in their selfishness, in their immaturity, in their not knowing, doesn't have the ultimate determination of the outcome of what your story's like. Because your confidence is not in them. It's in the God who heals and restores you from what they've done to you. Your story changes. I want you to do this. I want you to bow your heads and close your eyes for just a minute. And I want us to spend a minute with God. And I mean, just let him speak to you. Let him identify and confront you about maybe that voice that's told you because you do this, because this has happened to you, because this has been done to you, that you've constantly disqualified you. And every time that God has dealt with you, and maybe even showed you things that he has for you, ways that he wants to use you, that you go back to, well, he would use me if I wasn't this way, if this hadn't happened to me, if I hadn't been born into these situations or circumstances, that he begins to speak to your heart right now. Let's just let him speak to us and confront us and deal with us as we respond to him. Let's just take a moment with God.